It was a cold, grey morning when Jack stepped out of his small apartment, his worn shoes clicking against the pavement as he walked to work. The sky was low and heavy, like the weight that always sat on his chest. He'd gotten up at 6 a.m., just like every other day, to get ready for another miserable day at his job. It felt like a routine that would never change, a cycle of bitterness, exhaustion, and barely enough to keep him going. But there was one thing in his life that still had meaning: Rocky. Rocky, his German shepherd, had been his companion for years now. The dog had come into Jack's life when he was at his lowest, right after a divorce that had crushed him and left him with nothing but his broken spirit. He'd adopted Rocky from a shelter, and the dog had been more than just a pet. Rocky had been a lifeline. Every time Jack came home from work, tired and beaten down, there was Rocky, always waiting, always happy to see him. Jack paused for a moment, looking back at the apartment window. Through the glass, he could see Rocky's silhouette, his large, loyal form standing by the window, waiting for him to come home. The dog had been his only constant in a world that felt like it was always slipping through his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in days, Jack managed a small smile, though it quickly faded as he turned and continued on his way to the office. The office wasn't far, just a few blocks down the street. But every step felt like a journey. Jack's hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his coat collar turned up against the chill. His mind wandered to the things that awaited him at work. Mr. Thorne. The man had been a nightmare for as long as Jack had worked at the company. Thorne was the kind of boss who took pleasure in making people feel small, and Jack had been his favorite target for years. It wasn't just the long hours or the unreasonable expectations, it was the constant humiliation. Thorne would find ways to call Jack out in front of everyone, taking credit for his work and making him look incompetent. Jack had been passed over for promotions he'd worked hard for, overlooked for opportunities, and always made to feel like he wasn't enough. But it was the little things that hurt the most, the casual insults, the sneers, the way Thorne would always find a way to remind Jack that he was just another cog in the machine. Jack had tried to keep his head down, to do his job well, but it never seemed to matter. Every day felt like another step toward breaking. As Jack entered the office building, the usual sense of dread washed over him. He walked past his co-workers, all of them pretending to be busy, eyes glued to their screens, avoiding the inevitable awkwardness of Jack's presence. He made his way to his cubicle, dropped his bag, and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to start. His mind kept drifting back to Rocky, waiting for him, the only place he ever felt truly at peace. But peace felt like something that belonged to another life, another version of himself that had long since disappeared. Jack took a deep breath and tried to focus on the screen in front of him, but then, like clockwork, the voice of Mr. Thorne cut through the quiet hum of the office. "Jack, I need those reports on my desk by noon," Thorne called, his voice dripping with condescension. Jack didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the familiar anger bubbling up inside him. The anger that had been building for months, maybe even years, but Jack had learned to swallow it. He had to. He couldn't afford to lose this job. It was the only thing keeping him from falling completely apart. But today was different. Today, something in Jack snapped. He didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way Thorne had looked at him when he said those words, or maybe it was the way he could hear the smug satisfaction in Thorne's voice, knowing that Jack would jump at his command. But Jack couldn't do it anymore. The thought of spending another day under Thorne's thumb, another day of being a puppet for a man who didn't care if Jack lived or died, was too much. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. His heart was pounding, his breath coming faster. For a moment, the office went silent, all eyes on him. But Jack didn't care. He walked toward Thorne's office, his steps quick and unsteady, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and something else, something darker that he couldn't quite name. Thorne looked up from his desk, a smug smile on his face as he always did when Jack came to his office. "What is it, Jack?" he asked, as though Jack were just another inconvenience he had to deal with. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He reached Thorne's desk in 2 strides, grabbed him by the collar, and in one swift motion, threw him out of the chair and toward the open window. Thorne's scream echoed as he was launched across the room, and the sound of him crashing through the glass seemed to pierce Jack's ears. It happened so quickly, in a rush of heat and adrenaline, that Jack barely had time to comprehend what he had just done. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the realization hit him. Thorne was gone. The room was silent. Jack stood there, staring at the shattered glass, the broken window framing the emptiness outside. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears as if the world had suddenly stopped moving. He blinked, still not fully comprehending what had just happened. His hands were shaking, his breath shallow, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the gaping hole in the window. He'd thrown him out. Thorn, the man who had tormented him for years, was gone. Jack couldn't believe it. The anger, the frustration, the years of degradation, it all poured out of him in one violent burst, and now, there was nothing but a quiet aftermath. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on the broken window, and he felt the weight of what he had done crash over him. The sounds of the office outside his cubicle, keyboard clicks, muted conversations, the hum of fluorescent lights, seemed distant now, like they were from another world. His world had just been turned upside down. What had he done? It wasn't supposed to be like this. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But in that moment, Thorn had pushed him too far. The taunting words, the personal insults, the way he made Jack feel small in front of everyone, it had built up to this. And now, Thorn was gone, lying somewhere in the street, probably unconscious, or worse. Jack stumbled back from the window, his mind racing. The weight of the situation was too much. He had just thrown his boss off a bridge. The very bridge he had crossed every day to get to work. His stomach twisted with nausea. There was no going back from this. He glanced down at his hands. They were covered in sweat, and he couldn't stop shaking. What would happen now? How could he face the consequences? He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to leave. Quickly. Jack turned around, grabbed his jacket, and dashed for the door. As he rushed through the hallway, his pulse was still pounding in his ears. His footsteps echoed off the cold, sterile walls. There were voices now, murmurs and whispers growing louder as he neared the elevator. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap in the face. He gasped, as if he had been holding his breath for too long. The city was busy as usual, cars honking in the distance, people walking past, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Nobody seemed to notice the quiet panic that was consuming him. But Jack couldn't focus on anything else. His eyes darted up to the sky, overcast with thick clouds. The bridge. That's where it had happened. That's where his life had shifted into something he couldn't undo. He needed to get home. He needed to see Rocky. His dog. Jack's thoughts were scattered as he walked through the busy street. His pace quickened, driven by an invisible force that kept pushing him forward, urging him to leave the city behind and find some sort of solace in his apartment, in his dog's calming presence. But even as he walked, he felt the cold edge of fear creeping up on him. He knew there would be consequences. The police would be looking for him, and Thorn's body would eventually be discovered. There was no escaping the reality of what he'd done. As Jack reached the corner of his street, he could see the familiar silhouette of Rocky standing by the window, just like always. The sight of his dog, waiting for him, brought a small comfort, something familiar in a world that suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. But as he got closer, something didn't feel right. Rocky wasn't moving. The dog had always greeted him at the door, wagging his tail, his ears perked up in excitement. But today, Rocky remained still. There was an eerie quiet around him. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he hurried up the stairs, unlocking the door and stepping inside. "Rocky," he called out softly, his voice trembling. But there was no answer, no bark, no wagging tail. Jack's eyes scanned the apartment, looking for his dog. He found him near the window, just as he had expected, but something was off. Rocky wasn't sitting calmly by the window like he always did. The dog was pacing. His fur was bristling, his ears flat against his head. His eyes were fixed on Jack, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. Jack froze. Was it fear? Anger? He couldn't tell. Rocky's reaction was unlike anything he'd seen before. The dog had always been loyal, loving, unconditionally so. But now, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Rocky's body was taut, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Jack took a slow step forward, his voice soft but unsure. "Rocky, what's wrong, buddy?" The dog's eyes didn't soften. Instead, they seemed to darken with something Jack couldn't comprehend. He took another step closer, but Rocky backed away, growling softly under his breath. Jack's heart pounded. "What's going on with you, boy?" Jack murmured, his concern growing. Rocky's growl grew louder, more intense. The dog was never like this. What had happened in the time Jack had been gone? Jack's mind raced, thinking back to the broken window at the office, to Thorn's body lying somewhere below. Had Rocky seen it all? Had he witnessed Jack's moment of rage? "Hey, it's okay," Jack said, trying to calm him down, but it was useless. Rocky's growls grew deeper, and he started pacing again, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. There was no wagging tail now, just an unsettling tension that made the air feel thick. Jack stepped back, unsure of what was happening. Rocky was never like this. But then, it hit him. The dog knew. Somehow, Rocky had seen everything. He had witnessed the moment of violence, the moment Jack had crossed a line he could never take back. And now, the dog was reacting. Was this fear? Anger? Or maybe something else? The bond between Jack and Rocky had always been deep, But now, it felt like the dog was more than just upset. It was almost as if Rocky blamed him. Jack spent the night in a haze of confusion and guilt. The apartment felt different, quieter somehow. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to change. Rocky never stopped pacing. Every time Jack would glance up from the couch, the dog's eyes would meet his, but there was no warmth in them anymore. The once loyal companion, the one who had always been there to offer comfort, was now a stranger to him. By morning, Jack hadn't slept. He couldn't, his mind replayed the events of the previous day over and over. The look on Thorne's face before he'd thrown him off the bridge. The sounds. The rage. Everything had been so sudden, so raw. And now it seemed like there was no going back. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing any sense of clarity he had. But there was something else nagging at him. Rocky. The dog's strange behavior had only intensified overnight. Now, Rocky was standing by the door, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on Jack as if waiting for something. What could the dog possibly be waiting for? Jack slowly stood up, his legs stiff and heavy. He walked over to the kitchen, his movements slow, like he was in a fog. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but the warm liquid did nothing to ease the cold knot in his stomach. He could feel Rocky's eyes on him, even though the dog hadn't moved an inch. "Rocky," Jack whispered, his voice shaking as he tried to reach out. "What's going on with you, boy?" The dog's only response was another low growl, a warning that Jack had never heard from him before. It was strange and unnerving. He knew Rocky could sense his emotions, but this wasn't just fear or confusion, it felt like something deeper. Something darker. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the door. As his hand reached for the doorknob, Rocky let out a sharp bark, followed by a guttural growl. The dog's body was tense, as if it was ready to spring into action. Jack froze. What the hell was going on? With a deep breath, Jack opened the door. His eyes went wide when he saw the officer standing there, a stern expression on his face. "Mr. Thomas," the officer asked, glancing at his notepad. "We need to speak with you about an incident yesterday." Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. He knew immediately what this was about. Thorne's fall from the bridge had been seen by several pedestrians. The police were already on the case. I didn't mean for anything to happen," Jack stammered, his voice sounding weak even to his own ears. "It was an accident. I didn't." The officer cut him off, his tone colder than before. "We're not here to talk about accidents, Mr. Thomas. We're here to talk about what happened at the bridge yesterday. And we need you to come with us." Jack's stomach churned. No. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. His legs felt like they were turning to jelly as he stepped back. Before he could speak, Rocky lunged forward, positioning himself between Jack and the officer. His growl was louder now, more insistent. The officer took a step back, raising his hands in surrender. "Hey, easy, boy," the officer said, his voice faltering slightly. He glanced at Jack, his eyes full of suspicion. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. We just need to talk." But Jack couldn't focus on the officer anymore. His attention was fixed entirely on Rocky, who was now staring at him with those same unsettling eyes. What was happening to him? The dog's behavior wasn't normal, it was almost like he was trying to protect Jack from something. Or was it from himself? The officer took another cautious step back. "Sir, if you could just..." But Jack wasn't listening anymore. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. The dog's reaction, the guilt he felt, the police at his door. It was all too much. Without a word, he pushed the door shut in the officer's face, the loud thud echoing through the small apartment. As soon as the door clicked shut, Rocky stepped back from it, still watching Jack. The growls had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. Jack felt the weight of the moment pressing in on him, the silent question hanging between them. "Rocky," Jack whispered again, feeling a deep ache in his chest, "what are we doing?" The dog didn't answer, of course. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving Jack, a silent sentinel in the room. It wasn't fear in those eyes. It wasn't anger either. It was something else. A deep, unsettling knowledge, as if Rocky could see inside of him, could see the darkness that was now growing inside Jack. Jack sank down onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The weight of the world felt like it was crashing down on him. How had everything gotten so out of control? He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in his thoughts, but eventually, he stood up and walked to the window. The rain had started again, soft taps against the glass. Jack looked down at the streets below, wondering if anyone had discovered Thorne's body yet. His throat tightened at the thought. There was no escaping this. And then, as if on cue, there was another knock at the door. This time, Jack didn't hesitate. He walked toward the door, slowly, his mind racing. But when he opened it, there was no officer waiting for him. Instead, there was a letter, an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was neat, but Jack recognized it instantly. It was from Thorn. The blood drained from Jack's face as he opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was short, the words simple, but they hit Jack like a slap in the face. "You think this is over? This is just the beginning. You'll regret this. And so will your dog." Jack stared at the letter in his hands, his breath catching in his throat. The words written on the page were simple enough, but they hit him like a freight train. "You'll regret this. And so will your dog." It was as if Thorn had known exactly how to twist the knife. He had been the kind of man who reveled in control, and even now, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Thorn was somehow still pulling the strings. For a moment, Jack just stood there, frozen. The letter fluttered slightly in his trembling hands, the rain outside tapping against the window like an insistent reminder that the world was still turning, even if his world had stopped. The weight of Thorn's words settled into his chest like a stone. Jack had thought that by throwing Thorn off the bridge, he had ended it, that he had severed the last tie to the pain, the humiliation, the endless torment. But now, it felt like the opposite was true. It was just beginning. Jack's mind raced. He looked over at Rocky, who hadn't moved from his spot near the door. The dog's eyes were locked on him, his gaze unwavering, almost as if he were waiting for something, waiting for Jack to make a decision, to react in some way. But Jack didn't know what to do. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he had no idea how to stop it. He put the letter down on the table, his hands still shaking. The message was clear: Thorn wasn't finished with him. But what did that mean for Rocky? And why did it feel like the dog understood something Jack didn't? "Rocky," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. He kneeled down in front of the dog, trying to reach him, but the dog didn't budge. The tension in the air was suffocating. There was no wagging tail, no eager bark. Just cold, intense eyes that seemed to hold something Jack couldn't quite place. For a moment, he thought he saw a flash of something in the dog's eyes, something familiar, something he hadn't seen in a while. Anger. A deep, burning fury that seemed almost human. Jack recoiled, taken aback by the look in Rocky's eyes. Was it possible? Could the dog have understood what had happened? Could he know that Jack had crossed a line that couldn't be undone? Without warning, Rocky let out a growl, a deep, resonating sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. It was the kind of growl that sent a clear message: stay away. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. What was happening? The dog, who had once been a symbol of unconditional loyalty, was now acting like a stranger. His eyes were fixed on Jack with an intensity that made the air thick with tension. Jack had never seen Rocky like this before. Had he really crossed a point of no return? As if on cue, the phone rang. Jack jerked at the sound, almost relieved for the distraction, but when he picked up the receiver, he was met with a voice that made his stomach drop. "Mr. Thomas?" It was an unfamiliar voice. "This is Detective Davis with the police department. We need to speak with you about the incident yesterday. We believe you might have some information about a possible witness who saw what happened at the bridge." Jack's heart raced as his mind scrambled to process the words. A witness? He didn't know what to say. He couldn't let them find him, not with everything hanging in the balance. Not after what he'd done. He glanced over at Rocky, who was now standing, his body tense and alert, as though he could sense the impending danger. I don't know anything about a witness," Jack stammered, his voice shaky. "I wasn't there. I don't know what happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the voice on the phone spoke again, cold and calculated. "We have a witness who saw a dog near the scene of the accident," the voice said. "A large German Shepherd. We were hoping you could shed some light on what exactly happened. It's important, Mr. Thomas. We'll be by to talk to you soon." The line went dead before Jack could respond. He stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, his mind reeling. A witness? A dog? Suddenly, everything clicked. The twisted smile on Thorn's face as Jack had thrown him off the bridge, the sense of control he always had, the way the letter had made Jack feel as though he was still being watched. And now, the police were involved. But it wasn't just Jack they were after, it was Rocky too. Jack turned slowly to face the dog, who was now pacing again. His eyes never left Jack. Rocky knew. Somehow, Rocky had seen it all. And now, it seemed like the dog was no longer just a part of Jack's life. Rocky had become a witness in a crime, perhaps the only one. Jack sank down onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The walls of his own apartment, once his sanctuary, were now closing in on him. Every inch of the room felt heavy, suffocating. And the worst part was, Jack couldn't escape. The police would come for him soon. There was nowhere to run. And as he looked up at Rocky, who was now standing by the window, Jack realized with a sickening clarity that his bond with the dog had changed forever. Whatever Rocky had witnessed, whatever had happened on that bridge, it was between them now. And Jack wasn't sure if they could ever go back. But that wasn't all. There was something else Jack didn't understand. Why hadn't Rocky spoken out yet? Why hadn't he told anyone the truth? The dog knew what Jack had done. But it wasn't like Rocky to remain silent. So why was he holding back? Jack's heart raced as he took in the dog's silent, watchful gaze. Rocky had become a part of the story, his story, their story. But the question remained. What would the dog do next? The knock on the door came hours later, but it felt like an eternity. Jack had barely moved from his spot on the couch, his mind in a constant swirl of fear, guilt, and confusion. The police were coming. The situation was spiraling, and everything felt out of his control. He couldn't stop thinking about that letter. You'll regret this. And so will your dog. Those words echoed in his mind like a mantra, a dark warning he couldn't escape. What did Thorn mean by that? How could the dog be involved in this? Was Rocky going to be his undoing? Rocky was sitting still now, his posture stiff and alert as if waiting for the storm to hit. He hadn't moved since the phone call with the detective, his eyes still locked on Jack. What did Rocky know? And why had he reacted so differently since the incident? Jack's mind was reeling, but he couldn't find any answers. He wasn't even sure what questions to ask anymore. Then, there it was again, the knock at the door. It wasn't a casual tap, it was firm and deliberate. Jack jumped, his heart slamming in his chest. He took a deep breath, wiped his palms on his pants, and slowly made his way to the door. His hands were shaking as he reached for the handle, and his throat tightened with anxiety. He knew it was the police. They had come for him, and there was no escaping it now. But as soon as Jack opened the door, he wasn't met with the cold, stern faces of the officers he had been expecting. Instead, standing before him was a man in his late 30s, dressed in a black hoodie, his eyes hidden beneath a baseball cap. His face was tense, but there was something familiar about him. Jack couldn't place it at first, but then his heart skipped a beat. James Thorne, Jack whispered under his breath, the name coming out like a gasp. The man didn't respond, but his eyes flickered for a brief moment, as if the name had caught him off guard. James Thorne. It was Thorne's younger brother. Jack had heard whispers about him in the office, but he had never thought much about it. Now, standing in front of him, it made sense. This was the person who had sent the letter, the one who was keeping the twisted legacy of his brother alive. And he wasn't here for a friendly chat. You're the one who threw my brother off the bridge, Thorne's brother said, his voice low, almost dangerous. I've been looking for you. Jack stood frozen in place, too stunned to speak. The fear that had been gnawing at him intensified. Thorne's brother? What did he want? Before Jack could say anything, Rocky's growl cut through the silence. The dog had stepped forward, positioning himself between Jack and the stranger, his hackles raised and his eyes locked onto Thorne's brother with a fierce intensity. There was no sign of the familiar affection Jack had once seen in his dog. This was different. This was protective, territorial. Rocky, no, Jack muttered, his voice weak. But the dog didn't listen. Rocky stood his ground, unwavering, as if he knew exactly who this man was, and what he represented. Thorne's brother took a step back, his eyes darting from the dog to Jack. You think you can just get away with it, huh? That you can end my brother's life and just walk away? His voice was cold, venomous. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with tension. The letter, the police, and now this, the realization hit him like a freight train. Thorne's brother was here to make him pay for what he'd done. And he wasn't going to stop until Jack paid the price. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Jack said quickly, his voice cracking under the pressure. I didn't want to hurt anyone. It was an accident. Thorne, he pushed me too far. You have to understand. Understand? Thorne's brother cut him off, his eyes burning with fury. You don't get to say that. You don't get to apologize. My brother's dead because of you. And now, you'll have to answer for it. Jack could feel the weight of the words pressing on him, suffocating him. Thorne's brother wasn't here to reason with him, he was here to make sure Jack understood the cost of his actions. The same cost Thorne had extracted from so many others during his cruel reign. And now, that cost had come home to roost. Rocky's growl deepened, and the air seemed to crackle with the dog's unspoken warning. Jack looked down at his dog, the one who had always been his protector, the one who had kept him company during the darkest moments of his life. But now, as the dog stood between Jack and Thorne's brother, something was different. Rocky wasn't just protecting him. He was protecting something else, something that was starting to feel much darker. Rocky, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog's gaze softened for a brief moment, but he didn't move. Instead, Rocky took another step forward, his stance even more assertive. Listen, Jack said, trying to reason with Thorne's brother. This isn't helping anyone. I didn't mean for this to happen. Thorne's gone. What more do you want from me? What do you want from us? Thorne's brother's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "I want you to suffer," he said simply, his voice dripping with malice. "And I want your dog to pay for what you did. After all, he was there. He saw it all." Jack's eyes went wide. Saw it all? For a brief moment, he felt like the room was spinning, his mind struggling to catch up with the horrific implications of the words. Rocky had seen everything? Thorne's brother reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, dark object. Jack's breath caught as he realized it was a phone with a video already playing. And there, on the screen, was the moment Jack had thrown Thorne off the bridge. But this time, there was something else. There was Rocky. The dog was visible in the video, watching Jack's every move, his posture stiff and alert as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. It was like the dog had been part of the plan. Jack's knees went weak. He couldn't breathe. How had this been recorded? How had Thorne's brother gotten his hands on it? More importantly, why did it feel like Rocky had played a role in everything that had led up to this moment? And then, the real horror set in. As the video continued, the camera focused on Rocky's eyes, and for the first time, Jack could see it clearly. A cold, calculating look in the dog's gaze. What had he done? The video flickered on the small screen, the image of Jack standing at the edge of the bridge, with Thorne cowering beneath him. But it wasn't just the scene of the fall that made Jack's stomach churn. It was the way the camera lingered on Rocky, his eyes cold, his stance rigid. The way the dog had watched. Jack's mind reeled. How did Thorne's brother get this video? More troubling, why had Rocky been standing there, so still and almost calculating? The dog had been a witness, but why had he never acted? Why hadn't he barked or reacted like he always did when Jack was in trouble? Instead, Rocky had just watched, his dark eyes unblinking, as if understanding something Jack couldn't comprehend. Thorne's brother took a step forward, holding the phone up as if he were presenting some undeniable proof. "You really think you can just walk away from this?" he asked, his voice filled with bitter amusement. "You thought you'd get rid of my brother. But it's not over. Not by a long shot." His eyes flicked over to Rocky, who was still standing guard between Jack and the door, his growls low and persistent. Jack could barely breathe, his body tense with the realization that the man in front of him wasn't just angry, he was calculating, methodical. Thorne's brother wasn't just here for revenge, he was here for destruction. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. I had to do something. Thorne was going to ruin me. I had no choice." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The justification, the excuse, none of it made sense anymore. Thorne's brother chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You didn't have a choice? That's rich. You threw my brother off a bridge like he was nothing. But you're wrong if you think this is over. What you did, that was just the beginning. I'm going to make sure you and your dog suffer for this. You'll both pay." Jack's heart slammed in his chest. There was no room for negotiation, no plea for mercy that would change the course of what was happening. Thorne's brother was relentless, determined to make them both pay. Jack looked down at Rocky, who still hadn't moved. His growl had become more aggressive now, almost primal. The dog's behavior was different, too different. Jack had never seen him act like this. It wasn't just protection, it was something more. "Rocky," Jack whispered, his voice shaky. "What is it? What do you know?" For a moment, Jack thought the dog might respond. He'd always been able to read Rocky's expressions, his little quirks, the way he communicated without words. But now, there was nothing. Rocky's eyes stayed locked on Thorne's brother, unwavering, like a soldier waiting for a command. Thorne's brother moved closer to Jack, a twisted smirk on his face. "You're too weak to understand. But your dog? I'm not so sure about him. You see, I've done my research. My brother didn't die alone on that bridge. Your dog was there. And maybe he's not as loyal as you think." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His throat tightened. What did he mean by that? "Rocky's a good dog," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's always been loyal. He wouldn't." But Thorne's brother just laughed. "Wouldn't what? Wouldn't betray you? Oh, I'm sure he's been loyal. But let me tell you something, you've been treating that dog like your personal weapon, Jack. And you think he doesn't understand? He's not just a pet. He's a tool, a witness, maybe even a part of your crime. And now he's going to pay for what you've done." His tone turned darker, more menacing. "So, unless you want your dog to end up in the same place as my brother, you'd better start listening." The words rattled through Jack's mind like a cold wind, cutting through any last shred of hope. Had he been using Rocky all this time? Was that why the dog had acted so strangely since the incident? Had Jack crossed some invisible line in his bond with the dog, turning him into something else, something that couldn't be undone? Rocky's eyes shifted. For the first time, the dog's gaze softened, just a fraction, but Jack noticed it. It was like Rocky was finally acknowledging him, seeing him, not as a person to protect, but as someone who had made a mistake. Had Rocky known all along? Had he been waiting for Jack to realize what he'd done? Jack's chest tightened, the realization hitting him like a wave. He had been using Rocky. He had been manipulating the dog's loyalty to serve his own needs. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, it seemed like that very loyalty might be the thing that led to his downfall. Thorne's brother didn't stop there. "But maybe you can still redeem yourself," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Maybe you can make it right. The police will be here soon. They'll take you in. And if you're lucky, maybe they'll believe your sob story. But I don't think you'll be so lucky with Rocky. He's already made his choice." The words cut through Jack's heart. Rocky had already made his choice. Jack wanted to scream, to beg the dog to come to him, to prove that he was still the same loyal companion. But Rocky just stood there, his eyes cold, unblinking. Had Jack lost him forever? "Please," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to end like this. I never wanted this for us. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Not Thorne. Not you. Not Rocky." Thorne's brother stepped back, the smirk never leaving his face. "You've already hurt enough people. Now you're going to face the consequences. All of you." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Jack and Rocky alone once again. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack slowly sank down onto the couch, his body shaking from the weight of everything that had happened. He had thrown Thorne off the bridge. He had let his anger consume him. And now, everything was falling apart. The police would come. Thorne's brother would make sure of it. And Rocky? Jack glanced over at the dog. What had happened to him? What had changed? Rocky was still standing by the window, his eyes fixed on the street below, as if waiting for something. But what? Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He reached out a hand toward the dog, but Rocky didn't move. It was as if the dog had already made up his mind. And Jack wasn't sure if he could change it. The doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent, cutting through the tense silence. Jack's heart dropped. This was it. He had no more time. The police were here. And with that, Rocky finally turned his head. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Jack felt a flicker of something in the dog's gaze. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse, disappointment. Jack's breath hitched in his throat. Had he lost everything? The police arrived just as Jack stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his heart racing in his chest. The sound of the doorbell seemed to echo through the house, reverberating through his entire body. He couldn't breathe. Every second felt like a lifetime, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a routine visit. This wasn't just about Thorne or his brother anymore. Rocky remained by the window, his body tense, his gaze still unyielding. The dog had not moved since Thorne's brother had left. Jack called his name softly, but Rocky didn't even flick an ear. The dog was lost to him. And the worst part was, Jack wasn't sure if he could get him back. A knock came at the door, sharp and demanding. Jack's hand hovered over the doorknob, his fingers stiff. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, to get away from everything he had caused. But there was no escape. The consequences were coming, and they wouldn't be ignored. With a deep, shaky breath, Jack opened the door. 2 officers stood there. One was a tall man with graying hair and a stern look on his face. The other, younger, seemed almost too calm, like he was used to dealing with people like Jack, people who were caught, cornered, with nowhere left to run. The senior officer, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, didn't waste time. "Mr. Thomas, we need to talk to you about the incident at the bridge yesterday," he said, his voice cold but professional. Jack's throat went dry. He had already tried to convince himself he wasn't guilty, that it was all an accident, that Thorne had forced his hand. But the weight of the officer's presence, of the reality settling in, was undeniable. I told the detective already," Jack said, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was defending myself. Thorne, he was crazy. He was going to ruin me." Officer Daniels didn't respond right away. He just nodded, his eyes scanning the room. Then, his gaze shifted to the side, towards Rocky, who was still watching them from the window, his eyes cold and focused. "Your dog," the officer said, his voice suddenly lower. "Is this the same dog that was seen at the scene?" Jack felt his chest tighten, his body stiffening at the mention of Rocky. "Yes, but he didn't do anything. He was just there. He was just with me." The younger officer raised an eyebrow, almost as if he were questioning the truth of Jack's words, but he didn't press further. Instead, he took out a notepad and began scribbling something down, his eyes occasionally flicking up to Rocky. There was something in the way they observed the dog, like they had already made up their minds about him. "We've got reports saying the dog was at the scene, too," Officer Daniels said. "Witnesses say it was a German Shepherd, standing near the edge of the bridge. And according to our information, it wasn't just a bystander. Some say the dog was watching. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Watching? His mind went blank, the edges of the world seeming to blur around him. He hadn't been paying attention to the details of the scene. He had been too focused on Thorn, on getting him out of his life. But had Rocky seen something? Had he done something? The senior officer stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room. Jack watched him, unable to move, as if the room had suddenly become smaller, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. "Mr. Thomas, I'm going to be frank," Officer Daniels continued. "We've seen the video. The one that was recorded at the scene. Your dog was there. He was right beside you when it happened. Now, we know what we saw, and we know what the witnesses said. But there's one thing we can't explain. Why was the dog acting so different?" Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "What do you mean, different?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer's eyes flicked toward the dog again, then back to Jack. "Witnesses have told us that the dog wasn't just standing there, Mr. Thomas. It wasn't just a bystander. Some say the dog was reacting, almost like he knew what was about to happen. Almost like he was waiting for something." Jack's blood ran cold. Waiting? He thought back to that moment on the bridge. Thorn had pushed him too far, had pushed him to the edge. But Rocky hadn't barked, hadn't pulled at him in fear, hadn't tried to stop him. Rocky had just watched. The same way he was watching now. The same way he had looked at Thorn's brother with that unblinking stare. The officers exchanged a glance, as if they knew there was more to this story than Jack was letting on. Jack felt his stomach churn. He couldn't lie to them, not anymore. He couldn't pretend that he didn't know what had happened, that he didn't understand what the dog's silence meant. "Mr. Thomas," Officer Daniels said, his voice growing softer now, but there was no kindness in it. "You don't have to tell us everything right now. We'll be back for more questions. But we do need to know what your dog was doing at the scene." Jack's heart hammered in his chest as the truth began to sink in. Rocky wasn't just a witness. He wasn't just a passive bystander. He had known. And worse, it felt like he had played a part in it. The younger officer gave a curt nod and stepped out the door, but Officer Daniels lingered for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on Rocky. He was studying the dog, watching his every move, as though the animal could speak for itself. Jack's throat felt dry as the officer finally turned to leave. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Thomas," he said, before walking out of the apartment. The door shut behind them with a finality that sent a shiver through Jack's spine. And as the silence crept back in, Jack found himself alone with Rocky once more. But it was different now. Everything was different. He turned slowly to look at the dog, who was still standing at the window, staring out into the darkened street. His tail was stiff, his body rigid. He hadn't moved an inch. "Rocky," Jack said softly, the name coming out in a broken whisper. "What did you see?" Rocky didn't respond. Jack stood there, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The police were onto him. Thorn's brother had made sure of it. And Rocky wasn't just a victim of the situation. He was something else. Something Jack couldn't understand. Jack took a step forward, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. "Rocky, please. I need you. I didn't mean for this to happen." The dog's eyes flicked toward him. But this time, it wasn't a look of anger. It wasn't the cold, detached stare from before. This time, there was something more in his gaze. Regret. The tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Jack couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried, every room in the apartment felt like it was closing in on him. He kept glancing at the door, waiting for the police to come back, to drag him away in cuffs. But the worst part? It wasn't just the fear of losing his freedom. It was the fear of losing Rocky. Jack watched the dog, his body still tense by the window. Rocky's silence was deafening, and it unsettled Jack in a way he hadn't experienced before. He had always counted on Rocky's loyalty. The dog had been his partner through thick and thin, loyal, brave, and ever watchful. But now, the dog felt like a stranger. The soft padding of Rocky's paws across the hardwood floor broke the stillness. The dog turned, his body moving slowly, almost like he was thinking through each step. He crossed the room and stopped a few feet from Jack, staring up at him with those dark, penetrating eyes. Jack knelt down, his heart pounding in his chest. "Rocky," he whispered, reaching out a hand, his fingers trembling. "Please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted this, never wanted to hurt anyone." For a moment, it seemed like Rocky might respond, like the dog would rush forward and bury his head in Jack's lap, just like he always had when Jack needed comfort. But the dog didn't move. Instead, Rocky turned his head, his gaze flicking toward the window once again. His posture was stiff, alert. The unease in the room deepened, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was waiting for something he wasn't part of anymore. Jack swallowed hard. He knew that the connection they had was slipping away. It wasn't just the police or Thorne's brother that was threatening everything he held dear, it was the cold distance now between him and the dog he had once trusted above all else. Had Rocky known all along? Had he seen the violence in Jack, in his actions, before Jack even understood it himself? Jack stood up slowly, his feet heavy, his mind spinning. The dog hadn't reacted to his words, hadn't moved. It was as if the bond between them had shattered, leaving only a cold, empty space. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Jack's heart jumped into his throat. Not again. This time, Jack didn't hesitate. He walked over to the door, his steps slow and deliberate, as if his legs weighed 100 pounds. He opened it to find a uniformed officer standing there, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We found some additional information we need to discuss." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. He could already feel the walls closing in, the trap tightening around him. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. She stepped inside, her gaze briefly flicking over to Rocky before returning to Jack. She didn't seem alarmed by the dog's presence, but her eyes lingered a little longer than necessary. Jack wasn't sure why, but the way she looked at Rocky sent another chill down his spine. "I'm Officer Davis," she said, pulling out a file from her bag. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning it for a moment before locking her gaze on Jack again. "We've reviewed the footage from the scene of the incident," she continued. "We have a few questions about your dog's involvement." Jack's heart skipped. Involvement? His stomach churned. There was no involvement. Rocky had just been there. He hadn't done anything. Had he? Officer Davis didn't wait for Jack to speak. She continued, "Witnesses claim your dog was more than just a bystander. There's talk of him being aggressive, even protective, of you when you and Mr. Thorne got into that altercation. And we've also received reports about the way he was acting before the fall, standing by the edge of the bridge. Some even said the dog was leading you." Jack's head spun. "Leading you? That's not true," Jack said, his voice trembling with a mix of panic and frustration. "Rocky wasn't leading me. He was just there. He didn't do anything wrong." Officer Davis remained calm, unfazed by Jack's outburst. "I understand you're under a lot of stress, Mr. Thomas. But this isn't about what you want to believe. We've got witnesses, and we've got more footage to review. We need to understand the full picture. And we need to know what your dog was doing when all of this went down." Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. Was there something he had missed? Something he hadn't seen? Rocky's gaze flicked back to Jack, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something in the dog's eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't anger, but wasn't loyalty either. It was as if Rocky was acknowledging the truth Jack had been too afraid to face. "I don't know what you think you saw," Jack said, his voice low, his words coming out almost like a plea. "But Rocky's not the one to blame here. I'm the one who," his words cut off, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt completely exposed. The guilt, the confusion, it all washed over him in a wave. Officer Davis didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, her eyes piercing, calculating. It felt like she was waiting for him to crack, to slip up, to reveal the truth. And Jack felt it, felt himself unraveling with each passing second. The truth. The truth was that Rocky hadn't just been a bystander. He hadn't just been watching. Something had changed between them, something that Jack hadn't been able to see until now. Maybe Rocky hadn't been waiting for Jack's direction, but for something deeper, something buried inside of Jack. "Mr. Thomas," Officer Davis said after a moment, her tone softening slightly, though there was no sympathy in it. "If you want this to end, if you want to make it right, you need to tell us everything. Everything you know about your dog, about what happened, and about your role in all of this." Jack's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had pushed Rocky too far. He had used the dog, manipulated his loyalty, and now, it seemed like that very loyalty might be what led to the destruction of everything he held dear. As the officer stood silently waiting, Jack's gaze never left Rocky. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, and yet, Jack felt like the dog was holding a mirror up to him, reflecting all the mistakes he had made. Jack's voice cracked. I don't know if I can fix this." For the first time, Rocky moved. His ears twitched, his head tilted slightly as if considering Jack's words. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the dog walked toward him, stopping just a few inches away. The dog's breath was steady, and for a moment, everything was still, utterly still. Jack felt his breath catch in his throat as he reached out toward the dog, trembling. But Rocky didn't move. The silence stretched on. And then, with one final glance, Rocky turned away. The door clicked shut behind Officer Davis, leaving Jack standing alone in the room, his mind racing. The tension from the conversation lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of the weight pressing down on him. Rocky was still in the room, but the space between them felt vast, unbridgeable. The dog, once a constant source of comfort, was now an enigma, his behavior puzzling and unsettling. What had happened to them? What had changed? Jack's eyes lingered on Rocky, who had returned to his spot by the window. The dog's body was still, yet Jack could feel the unease radiating from him, even in the quiet moments. It was as if Rocky was waiting for something that Jack wasn't ready to face. The sound of the dog's low, steady breathing seemed louder than ever in the otherwise silent room. Jack walked across the floor slowly, every step deliberate, careful. He didn't know what to say to Rocky anymore. How could he explain? How could he fix what had been broken between them? "Rocky," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand trembling as he stopped just short of touching the dog's fur. The bond they once shared, strong, unshakable, now felt like it had cracked, the pieces scattered in ways Jack couldn't comprehend. For a moment, the dog didn't react. Then, slowly, Rocky turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Jack's. There was something in those eyes, a flicker of recognition, of something deeper that Jack couldn't quite grasp. Was it anger? Was it disappointment? Or was it simply the weight of the betrayal Jack had allowed to seep in between them? Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't mean for things to go this way," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Rocky. You've always been there for me. Always." Rocky's gaze didn't waver, but Jack could sense something had shifted. There was a coldness there now, a distance that hadn't been there before. Jack realized then that Rocky wasn't just reacting to what had happened on the bridge, to what had led up to that moment. Rocky was reacting to Jack's choices. His actions. The dog knew. He couldn't deny it anymore. Rocky hadn't just been a passive observer. The dog had been aware. Maybe more aware than Jack had ever realized. And now, that awareness had turned into something else, something Jack didn't know how to fix. The phone on the table rang, pulling Jack out of his spiraling thoughts. He glanced at the screen, and his stomach sank. It was a number he didn't recognize, but somehow, he knew it was from the police. Hesitating for only a moment, Jack picked it up, his hands shaking. "Mr. Thomas," a voice on the other end said, firm and direct. It was the officer, but Jack couldn't remember the name. "We need you to come down to the station. There's been some new developments. And we need you to answer a few more questions." Jack's blood ran cold. New developments? His mind raced. What more could they possibly want from him? He had already told them everything he knew. But something told him, something deep in his gut, that this wasn't just about the bridge anymore. The officers were closing in, and the pressure was growing. "I'll be there soon," Jack said, his voice barely audible as he hung up the phone. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but all of them were tangled around one thing, the truth. As he turned back to Rocky, he found the dog still watching him. The silence between them felt like a living thing, heavy and unrelenting. Jack stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, until finally, he spoke again, his voice raw and vulnerable. "I've messed everything up, haven't I?" Rocky didn't respond. Instead, he turned and padded away, heading for the door. Jack watched him go, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Was this it? Was Rocky finally leaving him? But the dog didn't leave the room. He stopped at the door and turned back to face Jack, his eyes locking with his once more. There was something in that gaze, something that almost felt like a silent plea. Jack's heart twisted. What did Rocky want from him? Was the dog waiting for him to fix this? Or was it too late? He moved toward Rocky, every step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the dog, he knelt down, placing a hand on the dog's head. Rocky didn't flinch, didn't pull away. But the connection between them still felt fragile, like it could snap at any moment. "I'll fix this, Rocky," Jack promised, his voice low, filled with desperation. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll make things right. I swear." The dog's gaze softened, just slightly, and for the first time in days, Jack thought he saw a glimmer of trust. But it was fleeting, like a shadow passing over Rocky's face. Then, without another word, the dog turned and walked away. Jack watched him go, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't undo what had been done. But he had to try. For Rocky. For himself. The weight of Jack's promise hung in the air, a constant reminder of everything that had led him here. The room was dark now, the sun having dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor. Jack stood by the window, his gaze drifting to the empty streets outside. His mind couldn't settle, couldn't find peace. He had no idea what he was walking into at the station, or how things had gotten so out of hand. The only thing he could focus on, the only thing that kept him grounded in this chaos, was Rocky. But even now, as the dog lay curled up in his usual spot, Jack could feel the space between them. It wasn't just the silence that filled the room, it was the distance. Jack had always thought he understood the dog, but this felt different. Rocky was no longer the loyal companion who had followed him through every storm, every twist and turn of their lives. There was something in his eyes now, something that Jack couldn't quite decipher. Jack turned away from the window, walking over to the dog. He knelt down slowly, his knees creaking under the weight of his guilt. The dog lifted his head at the sound, his eyes meeting Jack's with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "Rocky," Jack said softly, as if speaking louder would shatter the fragile connection that remained between them. "I don't know what happened to us. I don't know how we got here. But I swear, I'm going to fix this. I'll make it right." The dog didn't react. He simply lay there, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. It was a haunting silence, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had to fix this. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. It was a message from the officer. "We're waiting for you, Mr. Thomas. Please come down to the station immediately." Jack took a deep breath, the reality of the situation crashing down on him once again. There was no time left to waste. Whatever was coming, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He turned back to Rocky, kneeling down one last time. "Stay here, boy. I'll be back soon. Just wait for me." Rocky didn't move. He simply stared at Jack, his gaze unwavering. There was no wag of the tail, no sign of affection, just silence. And in that silence, Jack understood. He stood up slowly, grabbing his coat from the back of the chair. As he walked toward the door, he took one last look at the dog. "Please forgive me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the dog could hear him, or if he even deserved forgiveness. The sound of the door clicking shut was the only response. Jack drove to the station with a heaviness that made his hands tremble on the steering wheel. He didn't know what he was walking into. Everything had spiraled so quickly, first, the incident with Thorne, and now the accusations about Rocky's role. The questions swirled in his mind, too many to make sense of. But there was one thing he knew for sure, he was about to face a reckoning. When Jack pulled into the parking lot, he saw the flashing lights in the distance. The station was quiet now, but he knew the officers were still inside, waiting for him. He parked and stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting him like a slap. His breath fogged in the air as he made his way to the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officer Davis was waiting for him in the same sterile room he had been in earlier. She didn't greet him with a smile, just a nod as she motioned for him to sit. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice as firm as ever. "We've reviewed the evidence, and there's something we need to discuss. You're going to need to tell us the truth about what happened. About your dog." Jack's stomach twisted. The last thing he wanted was to talk about Rocky, but the officer's unyielding gaze made it clear that this was the only way out. He could no longer hide behind his silence. "What do you want to know?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to understand what happened on that bridge," Officer Davis said, her tone sharp. "And we need to know what role your dog played in it." Jack ran a hand through his hair, the guilt gnawing at him like a slow burn. Rocky didn't do anything. He was just there. He wasn't part of it. Officer Davis didn't look convinced. "We've seen the footage. We've seen how he reacted before the fall. Your dog was far more involved than you're admitting. And frankly, it's not just about what happened on that bridge anymore. We're investigating whether Rocky's actions led to Mr. Thorne's death. If he was used as a weapon, if he's been trained to respond aggressively." Her words hung in the air, suffocating him. Jack's pulse raced in his ears. "That's not true," he said, his voice cracking. "Rocky would never, he's not like that. He's not a weapon." Officer Davis's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought she might accuse him of something more. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone softening just a fraction. "Then why do you think he was acting the way he was? Why was he on that bridge with you, standing right at the edge, just before Thorne fell? You have to tell us everything. All of it." Jack's mind reeled. Could the dog have known something he hadn't? Could Rocky have been trying to warn him, or worse, had Rocky understood the danger before Jack had? The question swirled, and with each passing moment, Jack felt the noose tightening around him. There was no escape from the truth, and no way to go back. He was tangled in this mess, and now, it seemed that the dog was at the center of it all. The room felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in around Jack as Officer Davis continued her interrogation. Her words circled in his mind, each one leaving a mark, a question that gnawed at him like an animal in the dark. Could Rocky really have known something he didn't? Could his loyal dog, the one he had trusted with his life, somehow have been involved in Thorne's death? Jack's mind was spinning, trying to grasp the implications of everything. He had always seen Rocky as more than just a pet. He was family. But now, the weight of the officer's words felt like an accusation that went far beyond what he was willing to accept. "I told you," Jack said, trying to steady his voice. "He wasn't involved in what happened on the bridge. He was just there. He was scared, just like me. He never would have hurt anyone. Officer Davis didn't seem convinced. She took a slow breath and stood up, walking over to a table at the far side of the room. She picked up a stack of papers and turned to face him again, her eyes never leaving his. "We've seen the footage, Mr. Thomas." The dog was not scared. He was calm, focused. "When Thorn was at the edge of the bridge, your dog was right there. And from what we can gather, he didn't hesitate. He lunged at Thorn before he fell." Her gaze darkened. "That doesn't sound like fear, Mr. Thomas. That sounds like intent." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The thought of Rocky acting with intent, something so calculated, was impossible to reconcile with the image he had of his dog. But the evidence was there. The footage, the way Rocky had acted. It was all adding up to something he wasn't prepared for. "No," Jack whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not how it happened. You don't understand. Rocky would never hurt anyone." Officer Davis's face softened, but only slightly. "Mr. Thomas, this is hard for us too. But we need you to be honest with us. If you're holding back something, anything, that could help, we need to know. If your dog was trained to respond this way, to act aggressively, it changes everything." The words hung heavy in the room. Jack clenched his fists, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He couldn't breathe. The idea that Rocky might have been trained, manipulated in some way, felt like a betrayal in itself. But then, another thought flashed through his mind. What if it wasn't the dog's fault? What if someone had been pulling the strings all along? "I didn't train him," Jack said, his voice firm now, a spark of defiance returning. "I've never trained him to hurt anyone. He's just a dog. He protects me. That's all." Officer Davis studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for any hint of the truth. Finally, she spoke. "Then explain to me why Rocky reacted the way he did. Explain why he was so focused on Thorn when he should have been focused on you. And why was he at the edge of the bridge, right before the fall?" Jack felt his heart hammer in his chest. His head was swimming with confusion. Why had Rocky been so intent on Thorn? What had driven him to act like that? "I don't know," Jack replied finally, his voice raw. "I don't know, but I think there's something else going on here. Something that I don't understand. Rocky, he's not the same dog he used to be." Officer Davis's expression shifted. It was subtle, but Jack noticed it. She was no longer just the stern investigator. Now, she looked like someone who was starting to piece something together, but didn't want to say it out loud. She paused before speaking again. "You're not the first person to say that," she said quietly. "Others have mentioned strange behavior from the dog. From the moment he was brought into the station, people have noticed things." The words hit Jack like a slap. Strange behavior? What did that mean? He had never once thought that Rocky's actions were anything other than protective. He had always trusted him. Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from the officer, it was a text from an unknown number. His stomach dropped when he saw the words on the screen. "You need to come home, Jack. It's not over." The message was signed with a name he didn't recognize. The officer saw him look at the phone and immediately noticed the change in his expression. She stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "Who was that?" Jack hesitated for a moment, then showed her the text. She read it quickly, her brow furrowing. "Who sent this?" she asked, her tone more urgent now. "Do you recognize the name?" Jack's mind was racing. The name on the text didn't mean anything to him, but the words had the unmistakable feeling of a warning. "It's not over." "I don't know," Jack muttered. But I need to go. I have to." He stood up abruptly, but Officer Davis held up her hand to stop him. "You're not going anywhere until you explain this. Who sent that message?" Jack didn't answer her. Instead, he stuffed his phone into his pocket and walked towards the door. "I can't explain it right now. But I'll tell you everything when I get back. I promise." Officer Davis's eyes narrowed, but she didn't try to stop him. "If you're hiding something, Jack, you're only making it worse. Don't think you can run away from this." Jack barely heard her as he stepped out of the room, his mind spinning with the urgency of the message. He had no idea who had sent it, but he knew one thing for sure, he had to get home. Something was waiting for him. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel as he sped down the road, his heart thundering in his chest. The message, "It's not over," kept repeating in his mind like a mantra, but no matter how many times he thought about it, he couldn't make sense of it. Who would send such a cryptic message? And why now, when everything was already spiraling out of control? His eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights behind him, or worse, someone following him. But there was nothing. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was closing in on him. As he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his home gave him a strange sense of unease. He had lived here for years, but now, it felt foreign, almost as though it wasn't his anymore. The front porch light was on, casting a faint glow on the path leading to the door. But something about the way the light flickered made it feel unsettling, like a warning sign. He parked the car and stepped out slowly, his shoes crunching on the gravel. His mind was racing. He needed answers. But the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up, about the bridge, about Rocky, about what had really happened. Rocky, he murmured under his breath, a sense of dread creeping into his bones. Where was he? He hurried inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen. Jack's hand trembled as he reached for the switch to the overhead light, but before he could flip it, he heard something. A faint rustle. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling. Someone, or something, was in the house with him. He stood frozen for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. The house was quiet again, but that wasn't enough to calm him. He moved slowly toward the living room, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. And then he saw it. Rocky was sitting in the corner of the room, his fur matted and his eyes glowing with a strange intensity. The dog wasn't moving, but the stillness was unsettling. There was something wrong, something off about him. Jack had never seen him like this before, almost as if he wasn't the dog he had known all these years. "Rocky?" Jack called cautiously, his voice shaky. The dog didn't react. Jack took a hesitant step forward, his instinct screaming at him to stop, to turn around and walk away. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close to finding out the truth. Another step. Then another. Until he was standing just a few feet away from the dog. Rocky's eyes locked with his, but there was no warmth in them. No recognition. Just a cold, almost calculating gaze that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Rocky, what's going on?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog's lips curled into a slight snarl, and for the first time, Jack felt a flicker of fear. This wasn't his dog anymore. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood up. He wasn't alone. There was something else in the room. The shadows seemed to move, to shift in a way that didn't make sense. And then, just as quickly as the feeling had come, it was gone. But the unease lingered, hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice rising with uncertainty. But there was no answer. Only silence. Rocky growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back. The air seemed to thicken, the tension palpable, as if something was about to break. Jack took a step back, but before he could move any further, the door to the kitchen slammed shut on its own. The sound was deafening. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. And then, from the darkness of the kitchen, a figure appeared. A man. But not just any man. It was a man Jack knew, someone from his past. Someone he had long since tried to forget. It was the man who had trained Rocky. Jack's blood ran cold. How was this possible? What was going on? His thoughts were a blur as the figure stepped into the light, revealing the twisted smile on his face. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Jack," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "And now, it's time to face the truth." Jack's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he struggled to make sense of everything. What was happening? Who was this man? Why was he here? Before Jack could respond, the figure spoke again. "You've always known Rocky wasn't just a dog, haven't you? He was never just a pet. He was a weapon. And now, you've unleashed him." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Weapon? It didn't make sense. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The strange behavior. The cryptic message. Rocky's actions on the bridge. Was this all part of some twisted plan? Jack's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, his smile widening. "I trained him. I made him into something more than just an animal. Something more dangerous. And now he's yours to deal with." Jack felt his knees weaken. This was too much. Too much to comprehend. His dog, a weapon? How had he not seen it before? How had he been so blind? Rocky's growl deepened, and for the first time, Jack didn't recognize the sound. This was no longer his loyal companion. This was something else. Something dark. "You're the one who let him slip away, Jack," the man continued, his voice low and menacing. "And now, he's mine again. And he'll do exactly what I tell him to." Jack's world seemed to crumble around him. This was the nightmare he had never imagined. His dog, the one thing he had trusted more than anything, had been trained to kill, to follow orders without question. And now, that very dog was standing in front of him, ready to turn on him. "You're too late, Jack," the man said with a chuckle. "The game is already over." And then, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Jack's vision blurred as he struggled to focus, his head pounding. His body felt heavy, as though he were underwater. For a long moment, he couldn't make sense of where he was, but then, slowly, the fog lifted. The dim light of his living room flickered back into view. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. His legs were shaking. But there was no sign of the man. No sign of Rocky either. Just silence. Jack's heart was racing. Had it all been a nightmare? The figure, the sinister words, had it all been in his head? But the memory of that cold, calculating smile sent a shiver down his spine. It didn't feel like a dream. He struggled to his feet, his vision still blurry from whatever had happened in the darkness. His pulse thudded in his ears as he reached for his phone. But as his hand brushed against it, something caught his eye. It was the kitchen door. Still shut. It hadn't opened. "Rocky?" Jack called out softly, his voice trembling. Nothing. A faint, sharp scratch broke the silence, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It came from behind the door. He walked toward it, his feet dragging. Each step felt like a weight, but he had no choice. He couldn't leave things like this. Not without knowing. Without understanding what was going on. The closer he got, the more the air around him seemed to thicken. His stomach twisted with dread. Something wasn't right. Something had changed. His dog wasn't the same. Rocky wasn't just a dog anymore. Jack reached for the door handle. His hand trembled as he gripped it. For a long moment, he hesitated. Could he really open this door? Could he handle whatever was behind it? He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet house. Then, without thinking, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The kitchen was empty. But the moment he stepped inside, the smell hit him, a sharp, metallic scent that made his stomach churn. Blood. It was smeared across the floor in dark patches, leading to the back door. The refrigerator door was wide open, but the rest of the room was eerily still. Jack's eyes darted to the window. He could barely make out a figure standing just outside in the yard. It was Rocky. But this wasn't the same dog he had known. The animal was standing perfectly still, staring back at him, eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. His fur was matted, his body tense. He wasn't the playful, loyal dog Jack had raised. There was something dangerous about him now, something cold. "Rocky?" Jack whispered, but the dog didn't respond. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The dog's stillness was unnatural, its eyes locked on him with an almost predatory focus. A chill ran down his spine as he took a hesitant step back, but just as quickly, Rocky started moving. Not towards him, but away from him. The dog moved with the precision of a machine, a perfect, calculated motion. And that's when Jack saw it, the blood on Rocky's paws. The pieces started to fall together. The message. The strange behavior. The man. And now, the blood. Suddenly, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. His heart leaped into his throat as he pulled it out. It was another message, this time from the same unknown number. "It's too late. He's already made his choice." Jack felt the blood drain from his face as he looked up at the dog again. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything, but the only thought that cut through was the terrifying truth. Rocky had been trained to kill. But why? Why was Jack the one left to deal with this? Why was his dog being used as a weapon? In a rush of panic, Jack spun around and bolted for the door, but before he could make it, the lights flickered again. The door slammed shut, trapping him inside. He whipped around to face the dog. Rocky had already crossed the threshold into the kitchen, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. "Rocky, no," he shouted, his voice breaking. But the dog didn't stop. Instead, Rocky's lips pulled back, revealing a flash of teeth. It wasn't a warning growl, but something more primal, something Jack had never heard before. In that moment, Jack knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about survival. His legs felt weak, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. He had to escape. Jack dashed toward the back door, trying to reach the handle, but the sound of claws on the floor stopped him cold. Rocky was right behind him, moving faster than he ever had before, and for the first time, Jack felt the full weight of what had been building all along. This wasn't his dog. This wasn't the Rocky he had known. This was a weapon. A tool. And Jack was its target. With a desperate gasp, Jack yanked open the back door, but as he turned to run, the sound of paws slamming against the floor echoed in his ears. The dog was right there. Right behind him. He had seconds. Maybe less. And then, the world went black again. Jack's world snapped back into focus, and his head was spinning. For a moment, all he could hear was his own heavy breathing and the pounding of his heart in his chest. His body felt numb, the sensation of running still lingering in his legs. But as his mind cleared, he realized the truth: Rocky had caught up with him. He was outside now, standing in the cold night air, but there was no sign of Rocky. Jack's pulse raced. Where was he? His eyes darted around the yard, but the darkness swallowed everything. The streetlights from the nearby neighborhood cast a faint glow, but the shadows seemed deeper now, darker than before. He could feel the weight of something watching him, waiting. Then, just as the fear was starting to overwhelm him, the wind picked up, and with it came the sound of something shifting in the distance. The branches of the trees creaked, but it wasn't the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of paws on the ground, soft at first, then faster, more urgent. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the unmistakable silhouette of Rocky emerged from the shadows, his eyes glowing bright in the darkness. This was not the same dog that Jack had raised. This was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. And Jack was beginning to realize the full extent of what had happened. The feeling of betrayal flooded his chest, mingling with fear. His dog had become an instrument of destruction. "Rocky!" Jack yelled, his voice trembling. "Stop! It's me! It's Jack!" But the dog didn't stop. In fact, it didn't even flinch. Rocky's eyes were locked on him, filled with an unnatural intensity. It was as if the dog had no idea who Jack was. Or worse, maybe he didn't care anymore. Jack took a step back, but his legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. He wanted to run, but the sight of Rocky closing in on him kept him frozen in place. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to figure out what he could do. He was running out of options. He could hear the dog's breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, and his claws scraping against the pavement with each calculated step. Rocky wasn't just walking. He was hunting. For a brief second, Jack's mind flashed to the man, the one who had trained Rocky. What had he said? Something about the dog choosing him. But Jack didn't understand. How could Rocky choose to turn on him? What had been done to him? The answer was simple: the dog had been turned into a weapon. A tool of destruction. And now, Jack was the target. Panic surged through him. He had to escape. He had to find a way to stop this. But it was already too late. Rocky lunged forward with blinding speed, his jaws snapping shut just inches from Jack's leg. The force of the dog's leap sent Jack sprawling to the ground, but he barely had time to react before Rocky was on him again, his body a mass of muscle and fury. Jack scrambled backward, his breath coming in desperate gasps. The cold night air stung his face, and his heart was pounding in his ears. He had never felt so vulnerable. He wasn't fighting a dog anymore. He was fighting a monster. But just as Jack thought he was about to be torn apart, a sharp, agonizing sound pierced the night, the sound of a gunshot. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Jack blinked, trying to process what had just happened. His eyes found the source of the shot, and there, standing in the doorway of the house, was the figure, the man who had trained Rocky. The man's face was a mask of cold determination as he lowered the gun. He didn't even flinch when Rocky turned toward him, but there was something else in his eyes. Something calculating. "Get up, Jack," the man said, his voice flat, emotionless. "You don't have much time." Jack could barely comprehend what was happening. He stayed on the ground, his body shaking with adrenaline, and his mind spinning. "Why are you doing this?" Jack asked, his voice ragged. "He was my dog. What did you do to him?" "To me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a few slow steps toward Rocky, who was now standing completely still, his eyes trained on the man. The strange glow in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "What you're seeing, Jack," the man said finally, his voice cold, "is the end result of years of work. Years of training. The dog you knew, he's gone. The Rocky you loved is just a memory now." Jack's stomach twisted. "You turned him into a weapon, for what?" The man smirked. "Power, Jack. Control. Do you think it was an accident that he chose you? That he became attached to you? No. I orchestrated all of it. I knew what he was capable of, and now, you're seeing the result of my work. But the truth is, it's never been about you. It's about something bigger." Jack's mind raced, trying to follow the twisted logic. The man had been manipulating him from the start, setting him up, using his bond with Rocky to create the perfect weapon. And now, it was too late to turn back. "You're crazy," Jack spat, struggling to push himself up off the ground. "This isn't right. You've destroyed everything." The man's smile widened. "Everything you've ever known was just a stepping stone. The real game begins now." Suddenly, the man raised the gun again. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he braced himself for what was coming. But instead of firing at him, the man aimed the gun at Rocky. "You don't control him anymore," Jack yelled, fear rising in his chest. "He's still a dog. He's still my dog." But the man's eyes were cold, unfeeling. Without hesitation, he squeezed the trigger again. The shot echoed in the air. And everything went still. The world seemed to crumble around Jack. The shot had rung out, its deafening echo still buzzing in his ears. His gaze locked on Rocky, whose form was still frozen in the yard, the blood from his wounds staining the grass beneath him. But something was wrong, something felt different. The dog, despite the gunshot, hadn't moved an inch. Jack's breath caught in his throat. No, he can't be. He was shaking now, the cold air biting at his skin, but the chill that ran through his veins was from something deeper. Rocky didn't flinch. He didn't whimper, didn't stagger, didn't cry out. The look in his eyes, those eerie, glowing eyes, remained unchanged. As if the dog hadn't been hit at all. Jack's pulse raced. Was he dead? The man who had fired the shot stood motionless, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Jack's eyes flicked from the man back to the dog. He didn't understand. What was happening? Without a word, the man began to walk toward Rocky. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the silence. But Jack could feel it, the air had shifted. Something ominous hung in the balance. Then, as the man reached the dog, something happened that Jack couldn't comprehend. With a sudden movement, Rocky raised his head, his eyes still glowing that unnaturally fierce light, and he let out a deep growl. It wasn't the kind of growl Jack had heard when the dog was playful or protective, it was different. It was primal. It was filled with rage. The man stopped in his tracks, his gaze unwavering. "You're not what you used to be," he muttered, as if talking to the dog. "You're better now." Jack felt a surge of horror. He had always known something was off, but he never imagined it would come to this. His dog, his loyal, loving companion, was now a weapon, not just a tool of power, but a being so twisted that even the man who had trained him seemed uncertain of the consequences. The man slowly reached out, almost as if testing the dog, but Rocky took a step back. Then another. And another. It was as though the dog was distancing himself, suddenly hesitant about the one who had created him. Jack's mind raced as the realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. The dog wasn't just rebelling. Rocky was rejecting the man. Something inside him had snapped. It wasn't just that he had been turned into a weapon, it was that he was still Rocky, deep down. And the love, the bond, they had shared, hadn't been erased entirely. That tiny flicker of hope inside Jack's chest sparked again. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe Rocky hadn't completely lost himself. But then, the man's voice broke through the silence. "Enough of this," he said, his tone colder than before. "This ends now." With that, he moved faster than Jack could follow, closing the distance between him and the dog in a heartbeat. Before Jack could even react, the man reached out and grabbed Rocky by the collar, yanking him towards himself. The dog growled again, louder now, but the man was prepared, his grip tightening with a cruel precision. Jack stood frozen, helpless, as he watched. But the twist came next, a change in the air, like the pause before a storm. The man, having Rocky right in front of him, suddenly took a step back. He stared at the dog for a moment, his hand still gripping the collar. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, he let go. The look in the man's eyes shifted for just a moment, his cold composure cracking. For a split second, Jack saw fear. Fear of what he had created. Fear of what Rocky had become. It was as if the dog, with all his rage and confusion, had begun to fight back in a way no one had expected. Rocky wasn't just a weapon anymore. He was out of control. "Get away from him!" Jack shouted, his voice shaking. He didn't know what to do or how to help, but he couldn't stand there any longer, watching the man control everything. For a moment, Jack thought the man would turn on him, that his next move would be to kill him, maybe even destroy everything. But instead, the man took a slow step backward. He glanced over at Jack, his face twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace. "I gave you a choice, Jack," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you're too weak to understand." Jack didn't have time to respond. As the man turned and began to walk away, Rocky's growls grew louder, more desperate. The dog's eyes locked onto Jack's once more, but this time, something was different. Something had changed. The animal was no longer just fighting the man, it was fighting for his survival. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, watching the scene unfold, unable to do anything. He couldn't stop what was happening. He couldn't even reach the dog in time. But as Rocky stood in the yard, his body trembling with fury, the ground seemed to shift again. And Jack had the strangest feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The moment felt suspended in time. Everything was quiet for what seemed like an eternity, as Jack stared at Rocky, his heart racing. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the unsaid words, the violence waiting to unfold. Jack could almost feel the weight of the decision in the air. Rocky, the dog he had raised and loved, was standing between him and the man who had corrupted him. But just when Jack thought the moment would break, something unexpected happened. Rocky took a tentative step toward him, his fur bristling, his eyes still glowing, but there was something different about them now. There was a flicker of recognition. It was a quiet, subtle thing, like a spark lighting in the darkness. Rocky's body seemed to relax, just slightly, and Jack felt it too, a connection, fragile but real. The bond between them was still there, buried beneath the layers of control and manipulation the man had put in place. And now, the dog wasn't just looking at Jack, he was waiting. Jack's hands trembled, but he took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "It's me, buddy. I'm here. I never left you." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The world stood still. And then, in a flash, it happened. Rocky lunged. But it wasn't toward Jack. No, this time, he aimed for the man. The growl that tore from Rocky's throat wasn't one of obedience or fear, it was full of rage, the kind that comes from being pushed too far. The dog leapt at the man with incredible force, and Jack could see the surprise in the man's eyes as the massive dog knocked him to the ground. The man scrambled, trying to push the dog away, but Rocky was relentless, his teeth bared, his claws digging into the dirt as he fought. The sound of the man's shouts, the snap of the dog's jaws, everything felt chaotic, wild, like a storm had finally broken loose. Jack didn't know what to do. He stood frozen for a second, his mind racing. Should he help? Should he stop it? But the truth was, he didn't know if it was possible to stop what had been set into motion. Rocky's fury was unlike anything he had seen before. The dog was no longer just fighting for survival, he was fighting to reclaim his freedom, his identity. Every inch of him was consumed with the need to destroy the one who had taken everything from him. The man, now on the ground, tried to push Rocky away, but his strength was fading. The dog had him pinned, and Jack saw the fear in the man's eyes. This was the first time he'd ever looked vulnerable. Jack could see it now, the dog was fighting for him. For the love they had shared. For the life they had been forced to give up. "Rocky!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. He didn't know why he called out to the dog, maybe he was trying to bring some sense of control back to the madness, maybe he was hoping for a miracle. But the words seemed to carry more weight now. For a second, it was as if Rocky paused, as if he heard Jack's voice cutting through the rage, grounding him. The dog stopped for a moment, panting, his chest heaving, his eyes darting to Jack. It was that brief second of stillness that held everything together. In that moment, it was clear, Rocky was no longer the tool the man had shaped. He was his dog again, and nothing in the world could change that. But the man was still struggling beneath Rocky's weight, and Jack knew the fight wasn't over. He had to make a choice. Before Jack could act, the man's voice broke through the chaos, sharp with venom. "You'll never win. Do you think this is over?" He spat, his eyes wild with anger. "I've controlled this dog. I've shaped him into something you can't even begin to understand. He's mine." Jack took a deep breath, the weight of those words sinking in. But then, something in him snapped. No. Rocky was his. He had raised him, loved him, and no one, no matter how powerful, could take that away. "Not anymore," Jack said firmly, his voice filled with a new strength, a quiet resolve. In one swift motion, he reached down and grabbed a piece of debris nearby, something heavy and solid. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was enough. With every ounce of force he could muster, Jack hurled it at the man, hitting him hard across the face. The man stumbled, disoriented, his grip weakening on the ground. Rocky took this opportunity to shift his position, pulling away from the man, and in that instant, Jack rushed to his side. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed Rocky's collar, pulling him away from the struggle. The dog growled low in his throat but didn't fight Jack's touch. It was like the connection between them had finally come full circle. They were together again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't feel alone. The man, now bleeding and dazed, stumbled to his feet. His eyes were filled with fury and disbelief, but Jack knew the game had changed. The man wasn't in control anymore. Jack looked down at Rocky, his heart swelling with emotion as he felt the bond between them, stronger than ever. "Let's go, boy," Jack whispered, his voice full of tenderness. "It's over. It's just you and me now." Rocky's tail wagged, slow at first, but then faster, the small sign of life returning to the dog. Jack didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew they had survived the worst. Together. As they turned to leave, the man's voice echoed behind them, weaker now. "You'll regret this," he called out, but Jack didn't look back. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And whatever came next, Jack knew he would face it, with Rocky by his side. As Jack and Rocky walked off into the distance, leaving the past behind them, one thing was clear, their bond had been tested, but it had never been stronger. Together, they had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Their journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. If this story moved you, if you believe in the unbreakable power of loyalty and love, then don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these incredible tales of courage and redemption coming. Let's spread the power of love, the strength of friendship, and the message that no matter what, we're never truly alone. Stay tuned for more heart-stirring stories. Together, we can create a world where compassion and bravery shine bright.